quiet woman walks into a luxury car dealership, unnoticed and unappreciated. The employees see only her faded jeans and unassuming presence, not realizing they are ignoring the very person who signs their paychecks. What happens when the truth comes out? Let us know in the comments section below. Maddie Carter adjusted the baseball cap on her head, tugging it down just enough to cast a shadow over her face. The name embroidered on the cap was insignificant, just the logo of a coffee shop she had passed earlier. But it served its purpose. It made her look ordinary. Her reflection in the glass of the luxury dealership's towering windows stared back at her, and for a split second, a younger version of herself flickered in her mind. The scrawny kid from Ohio, trapped in the wrong body, dreaming of fast cars and open roads, but dreading the people who made her feel small. But Maddie had rewritten her story. She had taken control. 35 years old, transgender, and a self-made success. She had defied every expectation set against her. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived. And now, she was about to test whether her employees had learned a thing or two about respect, or if they still judged books by their covers. The dealership loomed in front of her like a monument to excess. Polished marble floors, sleek glass walls, and cars so pristine they might as well have been sculpted from diamonds. Maddie knew every inch of this place. She had built it from the ground up, and yet today she was just another customer. She stepped inside. The cool, climate-controlled air hit her face immediately, a stark contrast to the world outside. A salesman in a tailored navy suit passed her without a glance, his attention locked onto a man in a Rolex examining a sports car. Maddie hovered near the entrance, giving them a chance. Any second now, someone would approach her, offer her a warm smile, ask if she needed assistance. Any second now. Nothing. She moved further inside, tracing the sleek lines of a black convertible with her fingertips. The hum of conversation drifted around her, laughter, casual banter, the sharp, confident pitches of salesmen schmoozing with customers they deemed worthy of attention. Still, no one acknowledged her. At the far end of the showroom, a young woman behind the reception desk finally glanced up. Her name tag read Sophie. Maddie caught the flicker of hesitation in her face, the way her eyes scanned Maddie's worn-out jeans, the scuff marks on her sneakers. "Can I help you?" Sophie asked, her voice unsure, as if she wasn't convinced Maddie was actually worth her time. Maddie tucked her hands into her jacket pockets. "Yeah, I'm looking for a new car." Sophie forced a tight-lipped smile, her gaze flickering toward the salesman on the floor. Maddie followed her glance. None of them seemed eager to rush over. "Do you have an appointment?" The question was absurd. No one needed an appointment to browse a dealership. Maddie raised an eyebrow. "No. Do I need one?" Sophie's mouth opened slightly, as if she had an answer ready but thought better of it. I'll see if someone's available." She disappeared into an office, leaving Maddie standing in the middle of her own empire like an outsider. Her fingers curled into her palm. She had been prepared for this, expected it, but that didn't make it any less disappointing. Years ago, she might have let this get under her skin, let it remind her of every door that had been shut in her face simply because she didn't fit the mold of who people thought she should be. But Maddie Carter didn't waste time on disappointment. She took notes. She took one now, memorizing every salesman who ignored her, every glance that dismissed her before she even had a chance to speak. Across the showroom, one of the senior salesmen, James, was laughing a little too loudly at something a sharply dressed customer had said. He clapped the man on the shoulder, guiding him toward the newest model in the lineup, pouring his energy into sealing a deal. Maddie walked over. James barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, I'll be with you in a moment," he said, before returning his attention to his real prospect. Maddie let out a small breath, tilting her head. "I'll wait." And she did. She stood there, arms crossed, while James continued his enthusiastic pitch to the other man, his voice dripping with that well-rehearsed charm that had made him one of the top salespeople in the company. She wasn't sure how long she waited. 2 minutes? 5? She had stopped counting. Finally, James sighed, clearly annoyed by her presence. "You looking for something in particular?" Maddie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A car." James let out a short, humorless laugh as if the answer irritated him. Yeah, okay, but what kind of budget are we working with here? There it was, the assumption, the judgment, the expectation that she was wasting his time. Maddie reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. You know, she said, her tone casual, I think I'll make a call. James barely reacted, already shifting his focus back to the customer who looked like money. Sure, you do that. Maddie stepped aside, pressing a single button on her screen. A call. A moment later, a voice on the other end answered. Hey, it's Maddie. Yeah, I'm at the dealership. Thought I'd check in on how things are running. Could you send someone down? James wasn't listening. Not yet. But he would. Maddie tucked her phone back into her jacket, a small smirk playing on her lips. She wasn't done yet. Not even close. Maddie stayed where she was, arms crossed, watching the salesmen move around the showroom. None of them looked her way. Even now, after she had been standing there for long enough to be impossible to ignore, they still treated her like background noise. She had been invisible before, many times. As a kid, when she still had the wrong name, the wrong body, and a voice that wavered between what she was and what she was supposed to be, people had either ignored her or tried to correct her. Some called it a phase, others called it a mistake, and a few just called her a disappointment. She had learned early on that people liked things that fit, neat little boxes, clear categories, and if you didn't fit, they shoved you aside. She wasn't that kid anymore. A man walked in through the front doors, dressed in a tailored suit, a sleek wristwatch catching the light. Almost immediately, two salesmen peeled away from their desks to greet him. Maddie watched as James, the same salesman who had all but dismissed her moments ago, straightened his tie and made a beeline toward the man. His whole body language shifted, shoulders back, smile wide, hands clasped like he was about to seal a deal with a politician. The man barely had to step inside before he was greeted with open arms. Maddie smirked, letting out a quiet breath. Classic. She strolled over, taking her time. The salesmen were already offering the man a coffee, asking what kind of car he was interested in. Excuse me. James turned, as if just noticing she was still there. His expression flickered with irritation before he smoothed it over. Ma'am, quick question. Maddie tilted her head. That car, she pointed to the sleek convertible positioned on the showroom floor. Does it come with a hybrid option? James blinked at her, then glanced at the suited man, his real client, before answering. No, that model is gas only. If you're looking for something more fuel efficient, we have a few compact sedans that... I'm not looking for a sedan. Her voice was even, measured, not impatient, but not kind either. James seemed to sense something shift in the air, but he couldn't quite place it. His eyes darted back to the man in the suit who had started to check his watch. Maddie gave him an easy smile. Don't let me stop you, she gestured toward the other customer, stepping back. I'll just wait. James hesitated. She could see the calculation happening in his head. He didn't want to waste time on her, but he also didn't want to be rude enough to push her away completely. It was bad business to outright ignore a potential buyer, but he had already made up his mind about her. She wasn't a sale, she was a nuisance. That much was clear in the way he turned back to his original target without another word. Maddie's fingers tapped against her jacket pocket. She could have ended this already. A single call, a few words, and the entire energy in this room would shift like a flipped coin. Not yet. She wanted to see how deep this went. The glass office door at the far end of the showroom swung open, and Sophie, the receptionist, hurried out. She glanced around, looking for someone, and when her eyes landed on Maddie, something about her posture stiffened. Maddie recognized that look. It was the, oh no, I have bad news and I don't want to say it look. Sophie made her way over, hands clasped in front of her. So, unfortunately, it looks like all of our sales associates are currently with other clients, but if you'd like to come back later... Maddie raised a brow. They seem pretty free to me. Sophie hesitated, then tried again. I mean, they're engaged with priority customers at the moment. Priority. The word sat heavy in the air between them. Maddie had heard it before. Sometimes it meant VIP, other times it meant people we consider important. Today, it meant not you. She nodded slowly. Got it. Sophie smiled, as if relieved the conversation hadn't turned into a confrontation. If you want, I can take down your information and have someone reach out. I will be needing that. Sophie frowned. Oh, well, all right, have a good day. Then Maddie didn't move. Not until Sophie was safely back behind her desk. Not until James and the other salesmen had all but forgotten she existed. And then finally she reached into her pocket. She pulled out her phone and tapped a single contact. Hey, it's me. She kept her voice light, casual, like she was making small talk. Yeah, I'm at the dealership. Thought I'd do a little experiment. She paused, letting her gaze travel the room. You should come down. A beat of silence. Then, yeah, now. She hung up. The showroom carried on, unaware of what was coming. James was still laughing with his client, still riding that easy wave of confidence, still assuming he had the room under control. Maddie took a slow step back, giving herself the perfect view of the dealership. This was her domain. They just didn't know it yet. Maddie leaned against the edge of a display table, arms crossed, waiting. She had made the call, now all she had to do was watch. The showroom was still alive with chatter, the hum of polite negotiations and well-practiced charm. Salesmen stood near glossy vehicles, gesturing with confidence, painting pictures of success and status for their hand-picked clientele. No one noticed her. Not really. James had gone back to schmoozing, and Sophie had resumed her seat at the reception desk, scrolling through her computer screen as if the problem had solved itself. Maddie had been invisible before, but not for much longer. The first sign of change came through the front entrance. Quick, sharp, purposeful footsteps against the tile. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a dark blazer, strode inside. His expression was tight, his mouth set in a line that suggested urgent business. He scanned the showroom, locking onto Maddie almost immediately. She met his gaze with an easy smile. James, who had been in the middle of laughing at one of his own jokes, faltered when he caught sight of the man. The realization hit him in stages. Recognition, confusion, then something heavier. A small ripple of awareness passed through the floor as the employees began to sense that something had shifted. The man, Richard Lawson, regional manager of the entire company, didn't hesitate. He walked directly to Maddie, bypassing every salesman in his path. James straightened his tie, eyes darting between them. Miss Carter, Richard greeted, his tone clipped but respectful. I wasn't aware you'd be visiting today. Maddie pushed off the table, slipping her phone back into her jacket pocket. That makes two of us. The tension in the room changed. Not a full shift yet, not panic, but awareness. Maddie caught the moment James fully processed what was happening. His fingers twitched at his sides, his posture stiffening, as if willing himself not to look as panicked as he suddenly felt. Because now he knew. Now all of them knew. Maddie Carter wasn't just some woman in a baseball cap and sneakers. She was the CEO. And they had treated her like she didn't belong in her own dealership. A few of the salesmen near the back started whispering. Sophie's hands went motionless on her keyboard. Richard, ever the professional, wasted no time. How can I assist you today? Maddie could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her now. She let the silence stretch. It was a familiar silence, one she had encountered too many times before, when people realized they had misjudged her, when they understood too late that their assumptions had been wrong. It had happened when she was younger, too, when teachers refused to call her by the right name, when recruiters had looked at her resume and hesitated just long enough for her to notice, when people saw her and thought of her as a mistake before they realized they were looking at a success story. Maddie Carter didn't waste time on anger, but she never forgot a face. She smiled at Richard. I think the question is how your team can assist me. Richard didn't need her to say more. His sharp gaze flicked toward the sales floor. The pieces were coming together fast. James took a step forward, clearing his throat. Miss Carter, She held up a hand, stopping him cold. James, right? He swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Maddie glanced at the other salesman, then back at Richard. I walked in here almost 20 minutes ago. Not a single one of your employees greeted me, asked if I needed help, or even acknowledged me as a serious buyer. She let the words settle, watched them sink deep. Meanwhile, every well-dressed man that stepped through that door has been personally escorted to a sales associate within seconds. The tension doubled. No one spoke. James looked like he wanted to. His mouth opened, then closed. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the smooth confidence, the effortless charm. Now there was only regret. He struggled for the right words. I didn't realize. You didn't realize I was important, Maddie cut in. That's the problem, isn't it? More silence. Sophie shifted at the desk, her face pale. Maddie turned slightly toward her. You were the only one who even acknowledged me, Sophie. The receptionist let out a nervous breath, her hands clenching slightly. I tried to get someone to help you. Maddie nodded, letting that sit. And yet, no one came. Richard exhaled slowly, his jaw set. Maddie turned back to the floor. Here's the thing, she said, her voice level. I don't run my business based on appearance. I don't care what someone looks like when they walk through my doors. I care about how they're treated. James shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward Richard, desperate for an escape route. But there wasn't one. Because this was the moment Maddie had been waiting for. The moment people realized that underestimating her had consequences. She clasped her hands behind her back. This isn't just about me, she continued. I could have been anyone. A mother shopping for a safe car for her kids. A woman finally buying her dream car. Someone who saved for years just to be here. Her gaze swept over the staff. How many people have walked in here, been dismissed, and never come back? The weight of her question pressed down on the room. No one had an answer. Richard cleared his throat. I believe some changes are in order, he said, his voice cool and final. James paled. The other salesman stood rigid, waiting, knowing exactly what was coming next. Maddie could have stepped in, could have softened the blow, but she didn't. Because respect wasn't something that should have to be earned, it should be given freely, without assumption, without judgment. And today, her employees were learning that lesson the hard way. The silence in the showroom was suffocating. No one dared to move, not even the customers browsing the luxury cars who had sensed something unusual unfolding and now stood watching with veiled curiosity. The weight of Maddie's words had sunk in, but it hadn't fully settled. Not yet. James opened his mouth again, as if he could somehow explain away his actions, but Maddie was done with explanations. She had seen this before, men scrambling to rewrite the moment in their favor, to act as though their behavior had been an innocent oversight instead of a pattern of dismissiveness. Richard stood next to her now, his presence authoritative. But he let her lead. He knew better than to step in. This was her lesson to teach. You know, Maddie said finally, her voice calm but pointed, I never wanted to be the kind of CEO who had to walk into a room and make people afraid of their mistakes. I always believe that if you hire the right people, you don't have to remind them to do the right thing. She let her gaze travel over the salesman. But clearly, I was wrong. James was sweating now. His fingers fidgeted at his sides. Sophie kept her head down at the reception desk as if wishing herself invisible. The other salesmen shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances at Richard to gauge just how much trouble they were in. You didn't just ignore me, Maddie continued, pacing slowly between the cars. You ignored what I represent. You ignored the simple fact that anyone who walks through that door is deserving of respect, whether they're in a $1,000 suit or a $20 t-shirt. And she turned and her eyes locked onto James. Tell me something, she asked, tilting her head slightly. When you looked at me, what did you see? James hesitated, his throat bobbed as he swallowed. Maddie let the question linger. She had spent years enduring that very look, the moment of hesitation, the second when someone tried to decide what category she belonged to, what box she fit into. James knew the answer, but he didn't want to say it. Maddie decided to help him out. You saw someone you didn't think was worth your time. James flinched, his mouth opening, but no words came out. Maddie didn't stop. You saw a woman in casual clothes standing alone without a flashy watch or expensive shoes. You assumed I wasn't here for anything serious, that I was probably wasting your time. Maybe you thought I couldn't afford anything in this showroom. Maybe you just didn't think I belonged here. She let the words settle before she took another step closer. And when I spoke, when I asked you a question, did you even stop to listen, or did you just look past me, already deciding I wasn't worth the effort? James' silence was answer enough. Maddie exhaled softly, shaking her head. Isn't the first time someone's underestimated me, she said, more to herself than to him. I used to think that once I was successful, once I made it, I wouldn't have to deal with that anymore. But you know what? She met his eyes. It never really stops, does it? The room was still. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the dealership. It was about respect. Maddie had fought for hers since the moment she had claimed her identity. As a trans woman, she had learned early on that people would judge her for things beyond her control. Her voice, her past, the way she moved through the world, and even now, standing in a business she built, she owned, people still found ways to strip that respect away. But she wasn't 17 anymore, fighting for a seat at the table. She was the table. Richard cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice was even, measured, but laced with quiet authority. Miss Carter, he said carefully, what would you like to do about this? Maddie let the question sit for a moment. There were many things she could do. She could fire James and the others on the spot, clear house, make an example out of them. She could demand an apology, force them to grovel in front of her, make them feel exactly as small as they had made her feel. But that wasn't who she was. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to make sure this never happened again, to her or to anyone else who walked through these doors. She turned to the sales team, her expression unreadable. Effective immediately, she said, there will be a full reevaluation of how this team conducts itself. Every single employee will undergo training on customer engagement and inclusivity. Her gaze settled on James. That includes every customer, not just the ones you think are worth your time. James gave a small, jerky nod. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Maddie glanced at Richard. You'll personally oversee this. Absolutely, Richard said without hesitation. Maddie turned back to James and the others. I hope you all understand something. This isn't just about how you treated me. This is about how you treat people. You work in a place that sells luxury, but that doesn't mean you get to decide who's worthy of luxury. Silence. Maddie exhaled. She had said what needed to be said. But one more thing. She looked at James one last time, letting her voice soften just slightly. I used to be the person who stood on the other side of that glass, too, she said. I know what it feels like to be looked at like you don't belong. But I also know that people can change. James swallowed hard, nodding. Maddie nodded once in return. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the front doors. The lesson had been taught. Now it was up to them to decide whether they had learned it. Maddie stepped outside, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. The air was crisp, a slight breeze ruffling the edge of her jacket as she exhaled slowly. The energy inside the dealership had shifted. She felt it. It was the same kind of shift she had experienced many times before, in boardrooms and interviews and business meetings where men underestimated her the second she walked in, only to fumble their words once they realized who they were speaking to. She had seen that moment in their eyes over and over again, the realization. But realization was only the first step. What came after was what truly mattered. She leaned against one of the towering glass windows, watching as Richard took over inside. The murmurs of the sales team were barely audible from where she stood, but their expressions said enough. Some looked humiliated, others frustrated, but most of them, James included, were something closer to reflection. It wasn't about punishment. Maddie had no interest in making people suffer for their ignorance. But it was about accountability. A silver coupe pulled up in front of her, the tires rolling to a clean stop before the driver's side door swung open. A tall, slender woman stepped out, her jet black hair swept into a high ponytail, her heels clicking against the pavement. Avery Lang, Maddie's longtime friend, business partner, and one of the few people in the world who had been with her since the beginning. Avery was powerful in every sense of the word. Sharp eyes, sharper instincts, and a presence that commanded attention the second she entered a room. She closed the car door with a gentle push, adjusting the cuff of her tailored blazer. Well, she said, scanning the dealership's interior through the glass. I got your call. She turned to Maddie, arching a brow. Looks like I missed the fireworks. Maddie smirked. You missed the lesson. Avery let out a short laugh, shaking her head. I don't know why you insist on doing this the hard way. You could have walked in, flipped the room in 10 seconds, and been done with it. Maddie shrugged, and they wouldn't have learned anything. Avery studied her for a moment, then sighed. You and your morals. You'd be bored without them. Avery rolled her eyes, but there was warmth beneath the sarcasm. She nodded toward the dealership. So, how bad was it? Maddie crossed her arms, thinking. Worse than I expected. Better than it could have been. James? Maddie tilted her head slightly, still processing his failure, I think. Avery clicked her tongue. Ah, the delicate male ego. Maddie huffed a quiet laugh, then turned serious. It wasn't just about him, though. It was about all of them. The way they saw me. Her fingers tapped against her arm. You know, sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had walked in here before I had money, before I had the title. Avery didn't miss a beat. You would have walked right back out. Maddie nodded. Exactly. Avery folded her arms, scanning the showroom again. You think they'll change? Maddie considered it. Some will, some won't. But they won't forget today. Avery tilted her head, watching her. And what about you? Maddie looked at her, surprised. What about me? You're not just testing them. Avery's voice was softer now, knowing. You're still proving something to yourself, aren't you? Maddie hesitated. She wanted to say no, that she had nothing left to prove, that she had fought her battles, won her wars, and had nothing to justify to anyone. But that wasn't entirely true. Because some part of her still lived in that space, that memory of being unseen. The kid in the wrong body, the young adult fighting for a name that belonged to her, the woman in the business world who had to fight twice as hard just to get half the respect. Maddie had power now, success, money, influence. But no matter how much she had earned, there would always be people who looked at her and saw less. And deep down, some small, stubborn part of her still needed to remind them. Avery must have seen the flicker of emotion on her face because she reached out, squeezing Maddie's arm lightly. You don't have to keep proving yourself, she murmured. You've already won. Maddie let out a slow breath, nodding once. Then, before the moment could turn too sentimental, Avery clapped her hands together. All right, so are we buying a car today or just teaching life lessons? Maddie laughed. Let's do both. She turned back toward the dealership, the glass reflecting the sun, streaked with soft golds and oranges. The world was still watching her, still waiting to see what she would do next. And she had no intention of stopping now. Maddie stepped back into the showroom, the familiar scent of polished leather and fresh coffee filling the air. But this time, something felt different. The space was no longer just a showroom. It was a stage of reckoning, a place where the rules had been rewritten, and she had made sure of it. Richard was still standing where she had left him, his arms crossed as he spoke quietly to one of the sales managers. His gaze flicked toward Maddie the second she entered, but there was no tension in his face. If anything, there was understanding. Across the room, James was still lingering near one of the luxury sedans, but his posture had shifted. He wasn't lounging, wasn't acting as though he ran the floor. His confidence had been checked, and for the first time, he actually looked like he was listening. Maddie could feel the weight of the employee's eyes on her, but she didn't mind it. Let them watch. Let them absorb what had just happened. Let them learn. Avery walked beside her, arms folded as she took in the atmosphere. It's like a funeral in here, she muttered. Maddie smirked. It's the sound of realization. Avery nodded toward James. Think he'll make it? Maddie considered. That's up to him. She stepped forward, her boots clicking against the pristine marble. James? He stiffened slightly, but turned to face her. There was no bravado this time, no forced charm, uncertainty. Maddie studied him for a beat, then tilted her head. What do you think happened here today? James swallowed. He wasn't used to this, to being put in the spotlight for the wrong reasons. I misjudged you. Maddie arched a brow. Just me? His throat bobbed. He understood what she was asking. No, he admitted. I misjudged a lot of people. Maddie gave a small nod. That's a start. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I wasn't. He hesitated, then forced himself to meet her gaze. I wasn't trying to be a bad person. Maddie's lips pressed together. She had heard that line before. She had lived it. People always thought their biases weren't that bad if they weren't intended, as if harm was only real when it came with malice. Intent doesn't erase impact, she said. You made a judgment based on how I looked, and you treated me accordingly. James nodded stiffly. But I'm not here to make you feel guilty, James, she continued. Guilt doesn't fix anything. Change does. He inhaled deeply, nodding again, this time with more conviction. I want to be better. Maddie studied him, gauging his sincerity. She saw no defiance, no desperate attempt to defend himself. Just someone who had been forced to see himself clearly for the first time. Good, she said simply. Then prove it. James straightened slightly, as if those words had given him a challenge to rise to. Maddie turned to Richard. You'll oversee that, of course. Richard smirked. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. Satisfied, Maddie shifted her attention back to the rest of the staff, scanning their faces. This is the last time something like this happens in my dealership, she announced. From today on, the way we treat customers changes. She let the words settle before continuing. No more assumptions. No more catering only to the people who look like they have money. Everyone gets treated with respect. Period. The weight of her authority was absolute. Sophie, still seated at the front desk, gave a small nod as if absorbing the words fully. Some of the other salesmen looked uncomfortable shifting on their feet, but no one argued. They had all seen what happened when someone did. Avery cleared her throat beside her. Since we're setting new standards, she glanced at Maddie, lips quirking up. How about we put your employees to the test right now? Maddie blinked before realizing what she meant. Avery smiled at the room. We're here to buy a car. That simple statement sent another ripple through the showroom. There was a beat of hesitation, one Maddie caught, where the salespeople seemed to scramble internally, but to their credit, no one delayed. One of the younger salesmen, a man who had stayed mostly silent through the entire ordeal, took a step forward. He was nervous, but there was no hesitation in his voice. I'd be happy to assist you, he said. Maddie nodded, a small flicker of approval sparking in her chest. She followed as he led them toward one of the new hybrid models, listening as he actually engaged, not just selling, but listening, asking them what kind of driving they did, what mattered to them in a vehicle. James watched from the side, his hands in his pockets, still absorbing his lesson. He had a long way to go, but Maddie had always believed in giving people the chance to do better. By the time she and Avery finalized the deal, the mood in the dealership had changed. The tension had eased, replaced with something steadier, more focused. It was no longer just a place that sold cars. It was a place that was learning how to respect its customers. As Maddie and Avery walked out, papers signed, keys in hand, the sun was beginning to dip into the horizon, casting warm golden streaks across the parking lot. Avery dangled the keys between her fingers. Not bad for a day's work? Maddie smirked. Which part, teaching a lesson or buying a new ride? Avery hummed thoughtfully. Both. They reached the car, a sleek black hybrid, a testament to change in more ways than one. Maddie ran a hand along the hood, then looked back at the dealership one last time. She had come here today expecting disappointment. Instead, she had set a new standard. For them, for herself, for every person who had ever walked into a space and been dismissed before they had the chance to prove they belonged. Avery tossed her the keys. Ready? Maddie smiled. Always. With that, she slid into the driver's seat and pulled out of the dealership, leaving behind more than just a lesson. She left behind a legacy.